Welcome to the FarmBits podcast, a product of Nebraska Extension Digital Agriculture. I'm Jackson Stansel.
And I'm Samantha Teton.
And we come to you each week to discuss the trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews and panels with experts, producers, and innovators from all sectors of digital technology, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology. Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the FarmBits podcast. We are continuing on in our Quantifying Soil Spatial Variability series in this episode.
The focus of this episode is management zones, but unlike in our previous episode talking about soil, water, and topography maps produced by Croptomistic Technologies, this episode features an academic perspective. Dr. Newell Kitchen, a soil scientist with the USDA ARS in Columbia, Missouri, is our guest for this episode.
Newell has a wealth of experience working with soil spatial variability during his graduate research and professional research career at the University of Missouri and the USDA. Notably, Newell was one of the investigators who helped develop Management Zone Analyst, a software offered by the USDA designed to be a fundamental software for future developments in management zone creation automation.
In this discussion with Newell, we will explore what management zones really are, what the motivation for creating them should be, what the value proposition is for growers, and where he thinks we're heading with management zones in the future. There's lots to learn, so sit back and enjoy our conversation with Dr. Newell Kitchen.
Okay, be brief about my upbringing. I grew up out west myself in an area of Utah that if we didn't have irrigation, you grew cheatgrass, and that was about it, you know. So I know Nebraska is a land of very dependent upon irrigation agriculture, and so it was in my upbringing. Of course, it was pretty rough type irrigation, no pivot systems. It was all furrow irrigation is what I grew up in. Spent a lot of time playing in the ditches. And as a little boy, playing with water in the ditches, that was great adventure. I loved, we had a small farm, and a few animals and so forth, and first started in actually first year, couple years in more of a botany kind of an area. Loved learning about plants through that basic plant science kind of an approach, and a lot of taxonomy kind of classes, and just really enjoyed that. Then my father retired from the company he'd worked for and started an air pollution testing company and asked me to help him with that. And so I thought, well, maybe I want to do this for a career. So I kind of switched over and started taking some engineering classes. But after a couple semesters, I thought, this is okay, but this is not me. And it was kind of hard to go to Dad and say, there's got to be something else. And so I kind of returned back to plants, but more the applied, and ended up talking to some professors in agronomy at Brigham Young University. They said, try it out for a semester, and I did, and I loved it. And so finished my degree at Brigham Young University, and then came here to Missouri for my master's, returned back west for a PhD program at Colorado State University, Fort Collins. So I've kind of been going back and forth a little bit, east and west, not so much north-south. Finished my PhD working with Gary Peterson, Dwayne Westfall, who did a little research on dryland agroecosystem research, nutrient management research out on the plains of eastern Colorado. And most of my work was in nitrogen management as part of my PhD work there. And then in 1990, came here to University of Missouri as a part of what was called the Management Systems Evaluation Project. Assessment project. It was a regional project, 7 states here in the Midwest, and Nebraska was one of those states. Worked quite a bit with Darrell Watts and Jim Shippers. So you're probably familiar with those names. So as a new fresh graduate student, being mentored under those kind of individuals, I came in as a project manager for the Missouri project, selecting sites and implementing the project research. And actually was with the University of Missouri for 6 years, and then an opportunity became available to move into a position with USDA ARS, the Cropping Systems Water Quality Research Unit here on the campus of the University of Missouri, and have been associated in that with that research unit ever since, so about 25 years. So that's my background. My interest has really been a lot. Started with really nutrient management, cropping systems, but back in the early 1990s, that's when we spent about $50,000 for our first GPS unit. That was a high precision GPS unit. I remember it was bulky, it was big, and we thought we were so cool. And there was a lot of things that we were implementing relative to kind of getting location information. Of course, that fed into our thinking relative to precision agriculture. Ken Sudduth is an agriculture engineer that I've worked closely with here, and he and I have kind of worked close together. The agronomist, soil scientist, ag engineer, and you'll see a lot of papers that we kind of co-author and work together with our between each other and our graduate students and postdocs, and so it's really been kind of a nice arrangement to have that type of association with someone who likes to develop the toys and the sensors and really has that engineering perspective. So I kind of see the two of you kind of almost in that same mode here right now. So
absolutely.
So precision agriculture has been a big part of what we've done. I don't know how more detailed you want me to get right now, or is that sufficient?
That's great.
That is fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to that story. I had no idea that you grew up in Utah. I never would have guessed either, I don't think. So that's cool to hear how your entire career path got shaped. So you've talked a little bit about your research partnership with Ken Sudduth there at the University of Missouri, who I believe you worked on Management Zone Analyst with. So would you mind telling us a little bit more maybe about that project as well as some of your current research that you're working on?
Sure. Of course, that goes way back when in the early 1990s, maybe even a little bit into 1980s is when, there was a lot of grid soil sampling starting, and people were starting to say, do we sample on a grid, or do we kind of break up fields into like areas and just subfields within the larger field? And so the concept of management zone was kind of being developed. What does this really mean? How do you develop these management zones? How large, how small do these management zones need to be? And I had a graduate student that was interested in looking at that, and as a part of a master's degree. And so he was the one that developed the software, wrote out provided the guidance for that, and so this management zone analyst was a software that really just used some pretty simple clustering kind of algorithms to take input data and really devoid of the GPS information. I guess you could put GPS information in there too, but you put in soil electrical conductivity information, you put in soil fertility information, you put in whatever you have, and then a slope. It could be relative elevation. There are a lot of things you could, and I think initially it was, well, if you have it, why not throw it in and use it? And that was part of the danger, or the hazard of doing that, is because it kind of threw away basic first principles of agronomy. And because you assumed if you had it that it should be used, you collected the data, so why should you not use it? And without maybe thinking about it in terms of what is it that really makes a difference for this particular operation or these fields that we're looking at, that we want to do these clustering algorithms and kind of build some kind of a zone management zone map for the field. And so a lot of people over the years have used it, unfortunately, perhaps in a way to where it shouldn't be. And as time has gone on, we've given a few presentations talking about the importance of looking at your input values and the input variables that you have, and recognizing that there are some things that are really important and some things that you aren't important. And you got to look at your end product. What am I wanting to use these management zones? And a management zone for nitrogen management may be a whole lot different than it is for phosphorus management or water management, and or even pest control. And so you have to kind of start at your end product and say, what is it about the soil and the landscape and the way this has been managed in the past that are the controlling factors relative to this particular abiotic or biotic stress that's going to happen with the crop. And then you back into, you say, what is the information that's going to be most relevant to creating that? Then you put those into, perhaps a process like what Management Zone Analyst does to create those zones. And since then, there's been a lot of software companies, GIS packages that have built these same type of procedures into them. They're probably even much more elegant in doing that than what that initial software was. So we really haven't, ARS is not in the business of building software and servicing it in a way that is intended to be like a business. Because these softwares that we've worked with over the years, there's a couple of them. There's the yield editor software too. It's mostly the public service. Here it is, kind of take it. Companies can take it and do with it what they want from there, and that's kind of it. So it's almost a primer to something that might end up in a more of a service kind of a software that would be more have more utility from the standpoint of being able to crunch it out and get it out quickly. So most anyway, so there's I think, my understanding, there's a lot of people that have used, again, it's not even the exact same algorithms, but some algorithms very similar to what are found in Management Zone Analyst, and have included those in software packages and GIS packages to kind of create the same type of product.
Yeah.
I think we're going to dive into the Management Zone Analyst a little bit more because we love what you said about, you have to think about what your purpose is. And so we'll come to that, but we want to back up a little bit.
Okay.
Can you talk about, we've discussed in some of our previous episodes, soil sampling and on-the-go soil sensors. Can you give us a little bit of your insight into how these different data layers work together to quantify soil spatial variability in a farmer's field?
Well, that's a pretty big question you just asked. So again, it goes back to just kind of first principle agronomy, and you have to think about it in terms of what are those factors, those that are contributing the most to a crop in terms of both in terms of providing a more suitable environment or a less suitable environment that you might have within the same boundaries of a field. And so the sensors, the different types of sensors you might lean on, or not just sensors, but maybe even soil sample type information, have to really tie to those first principles. And over time, the more I've realized that, start with really getting a very, very good understanding of the soil resource from the standpoint of water. And that's that sounds so simple, and it sounds so obvious, but some people still, they want to jump off and they want to go do something. Oh, let's talk about micronutrients, or let's talk about, whatever. And I'm thinking, yeah, but make sure you understand that soil resource from the standpoint of its ability to get water into the profile and store the water in the profile. So it's kind of a rate into the profile, and also the capacity to hold it. And obviously, if you have a sandier soil, it goes in really well, but it also goes out very well. And because of that, you just don't have a large, you don't have capacity. And certainly in Nebraska, where there's a lot of soils that, have a lot of sand through the profile. And so that capacity to hold plant available water is less. And so you got to be very, very cognizant of the irrigation management on those kind of soils. On the other hand, if you have a soil like we have down here in Missouri, an alpha sol that with a really pronounced clay pan and just a little bit of slope, the infiltration through the clay pan itself is so low that we have on these soils, it's not uncommon to have on the order of about 30 to 40% of the annual precip is going off the field to surface runoff. And so, of course, there's all kinds of conservation concerns that you need to have when you got that high propensity for water erosion. But it also means that you can't store it. You can't get it into the profile fast enough to get it stored. There's quite a high capacity to store, but it's hard to get it into the soil. And so when you learn kind of the big pictures of a big picture of the soil from the standpoint of water in and water stored, and you kind of understand those factors, and you say, well, what kind of measurements do we have that we can take very quickly, very cost effectively to kind of help us to do that. And early on, we started working back in the early 90s with soil electrical conductivity, did some work ourselves with the electromagnetic induction version of those sensors. And then actually, as our research group with some conversations, Eric Lund gave us a call and he said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And he came, as I recall, he came over to Columbia and we sat down and we talked, and mostly with Cam, but had quite a few conversations about, what if you're about doing this with some coulters, and he went back to work and they, designed and fabricated, conductivity sensing, EC sensing using those coulters, which has been very, very effective too. So, and that it's just a measure of conductivity, but there's so many soil properties from the standpoint of particularly texture and soil organic matter that you can relate those soil EC. And it's oftentimes is only best done if there's maybe it doesn't have to be on an individual field, but on a farm or certain locale basis, some calibration to those numbers, because water has a big impact on it. Maybe there has to be some calibration relative to the different times of season you might take those, but it certainly gives you a very quick picture of the relative differences you have within the field. And a lot of producers have said, hey, I get this, this is saying this is a higher EC area, and it may be an area where they have their higher yields. They can see that relationship between the spatial variability of soil EC and crop yield, and particularly in a more of a dry land type scenario as opposed to an irrigated. So I think working at it from the standpoint, what first? Let's think of soil water, and let's think of what measurements do we have that can contribute to our understanding of soil water. And I would always put that soil EC pretty high on my list, and as a prime candidate to include in developing some kind of a management zone. And then you could, and of course, then you'd say, okay, well, so what's the end product? Remember, we talked about what's the end product first. And certainly if your end product is something that's tied to water, such as nitrogen management, then obviously you better be starting with soil water to begin with, and really understand that soil and its propensity for leaching or for denitrification, waterlogging kind of scenarios, and recognize that the nitrogen management goes hand in hand. In fact, people who think they can manage nitrogen without looking at the water really just don't understand the dynamics between nitrogen and water. Nitrogen is one of those elements that it's taken up by the crop it's fairly passive. It goes with the water. If the plant is taking up water to meet its needs, but it has a very low nitrogen concentration in that soil water, then good chance the crop's going to be choking when it comes to nitrogen. It needs more nitrogen. So it's about the concentration of the nitrogen in the soil water. And a lot of people don't think of it that way, but that's how I like to think of it. Mm-hmm. So so there's certainly that soil EC is going to be a critical one for quite a few things, that just because there's so many things that are related to soil water and water redistribution on the landscape, also is an important one. And of course, a lot of people think of Nebraska as being pretty flat, but there's a lot of Nebraska that has a lot of rolling hills too. And so there's those elements that you might get through a LiDAR kind of a map, you know, particularly a topographic index of some type, a water index that you might get. Again, the GIS software packages often have these built into them, which is nice. And so when it comes to water, those are the two things that come to mind probably first. And then from there, you can start adding on to it as you define the specific interests of what you're trying to manage. If you say management zones, you have to also say manage what. If you don't say manage what, then it's just a concept that doesn't have any direction.
I think that's a really, really good way to put it. And you know, you've kind of described all these different factors that may play into something like nitrogen. Would you mind describing maybe, for example, how one would go about putting together several soil data layers to manage something like phosphorus or potassium that is a little bit less dynamic, maybe is a good way to put it, using these management zone methods?
Well, for something like phosphorus, our experience has been that if obviously the input information that really helps to manage phosphorus, whether that's kind of at the field level or a subfield level, is really going to still be the soil test phosphorus. One of the things that you have to think about is that soil test and what is it, whether you're using a Bray 1 soil test or a Mellick or a Olson soil test. You know, it's a measure of potential availability. It's an index. It's just an indicator of that availability for that crop. And so the soil sampling still probably has to be in place. There are certainly been some attempts to try to do that with sensors, on-the-go sensors. Limited success, I think. Perhaps more so with, and going back to Varus, you know, they've got a sensor that's the pH variability, and certainly phosphorus is going to be somewhat controlled by the pH, or the solubility of the phosphorus controlled by pH of the soil. So you have a tremendous variation of pH in the field. That's going to tell you a little bit about phosphorus availability too. So there are some sensors that would go directly at phosphorus availability that I think would be important. But it may still be that in the end you're still pulling some soil samples on a grid or by a zone to help you to be able to understand the variation you have in the field. Interestingly enough, one of the things we find, and this is not, I don't know what percentage of fields kind of fit this, but we find this often, and that is at least here in Missouri, and I could imagine some of Nebraska's can be this way too, but in Missouri, the fields that exist today were managed as much smaller fields 100 years ago or 80 years ago. You know, the number of acres that a farmer can handle has just, you know, grown to thousands of acres, and it used to be tens to a couple hundred acres at most. You know, because it was so labor intensive, and the equipment they had then was just, you know, small scale. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it would be a 15-acre field here, and this field over here was divided up in 3 or 4 different fields. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting is some of that management that happened decades ago, you'll still see a footprint of that when it comes to something like phosphorus or pH, because those things just don't go away fast. And if one subfield area was managed with, you know, because it was closer to where the livestock were with manures, and it was easier to drop it on that field than go further away, then, you know, then then it's not uncommon for there to be differences by virtue of that historic management or this historic smaller field boundaries. So one of the things that farmers will often do when they go out and they do a grid soil sampling, they come back and they say, why is this into the field this way? You know, and it's because of things like that, things that happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. And they can't believe that would still have an impact today, but it will. So, and there's other factors. We have fields that are, if you have a gravel road next to a field and you get a predominant wind is from the south, you'll find that dust from the limestone will have an impact for several hundred yards into the field. So there's just factors you may not typically think about that you ought to when you're, so does that zone along the road, is it its own management zone now by virtue of that dust that's coming off of that road? Yeah, it probably is. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of natural soil variability, management inputs that have caused variability, and understanding kind of some basics about soil and soil chemistry and soil nutrient availability, what kind of factors cause those differences, and then you kind of in a Sherlock Holmes way, you start to figure out some things that are happening within a field in a way that you say, well, this is different because of this. If you can't say because of what, then you're kind of, there should be some logical reasons that it's different. And if it doesn't come back as being different, or if it comes back as being different, you got to be able to come up with a fairly good explanation for that. And so there's a lot of diagnostic tools, the soil sampling. A lot of farmers have also, I think, really over the last probably 15, 20 years have really kind of used yield mapping and strip trials to kind of go after what are those factors that are important. They may have a suspicion of maybe it is phosphorus or maybe it's some micronutrient. Mm-hmm. And so they easily can put in some strip trials. Of course, there's a lot of programs, like the one over there in Iowa, the Iowa Soybean Association does, where they're aggregating data across many farms. And I think there's a similar program like that there in Nebraska too. And basically trying to answer, is this how universal is this? How much is this really a factor? And so there's the power in the data across many farms that help to answer those questions way beyond the plot research that we've done in the past. So sure. Kind of going about your question in different ways there, but again, start with what it is you think it might be an issue that you want to manage. Why do you think that this is an issue? Is it just because, put your agronomic hat on? Why, use your observations. And I think there was one of the questions that you wanted to ask me about, farmers' observations, what they see, and part of that is when they see the visual of a yield map and they see that repeatedly happening over multiple cropping seasons, then it drives them to the question, why is this? And that's, I've always maintained that yield monitoring systems was the best way to take producers, farmers, and make them agronomists. Okay, mm-hmm. and because they kind of knew differences was there, but you can't ignore that visualization of yield maps that they have in their hands now, and it helps them to kind of, in a very natural, normal way, it takes them to the question of why, and that's exactly what probably the best value of yield mapping is. It kind of leads them to those questions.
Absolutely.
That really leads me into this next question here. So, we talk about management zones all the time, you do too in your research. If you wanted to convince a farmer that isn't currently doing that in any way, isn't variable rate seeding or isn't varying their fertilizer, what advantages, or how would you convince them that, classifying their field into zones is really important to characterize field variability? And then, like, piggybacking off of that, do you think some of this management zone delineation will be replaced by on-the-go sensing? So we think about our,
Sure.
nitrogen sensors that could happen with planting as well. What are your thoughts on that?
So, how to convince them that they ought to? Well, I think a lot of that is kind of, with some producers, it's wired into their nature, their disposition, and sometimes the light will come on very quickly, and they will jump on it and they'll go with it. There are obviously a full range of different dispositions out there in the landscape relative to producers, and some just don't want to, regardless, they just don't want to do things differently. And I don't know if you're going to convince that group of farmers that they should, because they just don't want to. They don't want to change. Their way of the farming is the religion of their farming, and they're happy with it, and they just don't want to change. And yet, so to the extent that you can reach farmers that have that a little bit of hunger for some discovery, hunger to be able to say, is there a better way? Is there some room for improvement? Is there a higher level of optimization that I can do? That's kind of almost got to be in place first, because it really is trying to tap into those individuals that say there's growth in the way I do things. There's growth in an increased efficiency in the way I do things. And so it's those individuals that you have to think about as ones that you're going to have an impact in helping them to understand that science and understanding of scientific principles, including the spatial and temporal variability that exists in fields, is a frontier of potential improved efficiencies. And the concepts of site-specific management and tailoring inputs to match the needs of the crop, it is pretty straightforward. Lots of times we like to think about it in this G by E by M kind of framework. Mm-hmm. And I even use that phrase that's mostly come out of academia with farmers now, and they go, gee, I get what that means now. They understand genetics, they understand management, that's their decisions. This E space, and you kind of spread that out for them. E represents, it's the soil water, it's the nutrient availability, it's the biology, it's the weather, it's the spatial distribution of all those things. And you say, it is complex, and it's not easy to define, it's not easy to quantify, but it is exactly what happens out there in the real world. And so there's opportunity in that E portion of the G by E by M for them to kind of improve their operations. And so obviously the more you can tie that to decisions that they can say, if I can make an extra $1.50 per acre, and I can push that over, 2,000 acres, maybe I should be doing it. Maybe there's a little learning curve getting up and going. Maybe there's a little investment in some sensor technology I need to do. We have, and I'm sure you have a lot of farmers that are over the last, 2 or 3 years. It's been around a little bit longer, but the sensors that are part of the planning operation, and maybe that's what you were referring to, Samantha, the smart firmer sensor. Mm-hmm. And I've got a graduate student that's working on that specific question. You may have seen his presentation at the NUE meeting last year. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. And Lance is really interested in that technology, and we've got some industry, other industry people not associated with the ones that produce the sensors, that are really interested in understanding the questions of first off, are these measurements reliable? Are they repeatable? How well calibrated are they to the actual measurement that you have in the field? And then more importantly, can it reliably inform an agronomic decision that really can make a difference?
In real time. I think that's the challenge
Yeah,
too.
it is. And so so you got to build and there's some concepts or principles that we would have down in textbooks that we would say this relates to this and this is going to have that, and you say, yeah, I get that. But then taking that and getting it all the way down to a kind of a simple algorithm, whether that's a universal algorithm or something that has to be somewhat tweaked depending on maybe like what soil association you're on, what type of soil you're on. But being able to show that it can make a difference, and it makes agronomic we have the agronomic support behind this, numbers to show that maybe it doesn't happen in a positive way all the time, but if you can show that it has a positive effect, half the time or whatever, then maybe that really is legit. You need to give some weight to that and use that. And so Lance has really been working hard on that question. We've been working on soils down in the Boot Heel part of Missouri, as well as here in our clay pan soils, as well as some of the alluvial soils along the Missouri River. A little bit more on the lush soils that are up out of the Missouri River plain. So lots of different soil types, trying to collect a lot of different data from our own equipment. We have 3 planters now, research planters, that all are equipped with those sensors. But we're also working with producers that have those same sensors and going right to their farms to kind of help pull that data set together and evaluate that. But to me, that looks promising. I really do think that there's some things that we still need to get more stable with regards to our understanding of it. There's some issues relative to repeatability that we're finding, but the sensors seem to be at least giving us really good relative an understanding of the relative differences that exist within fields, and not unlike what the soil EC does. But obviously now we're just talking about that little 2 to 3 inch zone where the seed's going in. I think that more, as we go on and we build those data sets and that understanding, there's going to be a whole lot more management zone development using those sensors that are right there on the planter. Or there's another very similar kind of a sensor system that Veris has. It's not on the planter or not on the firmer, but it can be right on the planter on a tillage piece of equipment that you could come up with the same type of agronomic informative information.
So I kind of want to synthesize a couple of things that you talked about there. One is the vast amount of data that we have available to us now that can go into these decision-making processes. And the other is both working with farmers to get that data on their fields and also helping farmers to potentially understand why management zones might be important. And from my experience working with farmers, I think there are a lot of farmers that are in the middle that want to kind of get into this precision space, but maybe don't necessarily understand everything that's going on the back end, which can make them a little bit nervous. And so would you mind breaking down a little bit, and this doesn't need to be a statistics lecture or anything like that, but just kind of talking about, in general terms, the processes that we use on the digital ag side to convert these data layers into the management zones that we see, so that a farmer can trust the process that we're going through and realize that it's not a black box.
Well, so there's kind of the first level. Let's say you have, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 different layers of data. And so let's say you have soil EC, maybe you have some soil fertility, maybe you have some yield maps over multiple years, and you're looking at all of this and you say, what do I do with this? How do I take this and make an informed decision going forward? Is that the question you're asking?
Pretty much. How do you get across all these layers? How can we possibly identify where we have similar regions within this field? How do we get there?
Sure. So part of what you need to be is, I think, you know, whether you're a scientist or you're a producer, you have to be critical of the data that you have in front of you, understand how it was collected, and recognize that some of those data layers probably don't really give you much value at all. And I know I can think of some research farms we've been on, and we'll collect this and we'll collect that and we'll collect all these things, and in the end we have to kind of look into, but what is the value of this? What does it really help us? So I mean, if you have a yield map on a field that is, you have 5% variability going across the field in a given year, I mean, that's probably not a yield map that is very informative. It's basically saying the type of weather you had that year has been ideal enough to where there was no expression of the variability of the soil by virtue of, it's almost like a kind of an irrigated farm where you're kind of spoon feeding that water that it needs, and so you can have a sandy soil, you can have a heavier textured soil, and it's you get about the same level of production on both sides of the field. So for more of a dry land scenario, if you've got a field that shows you very little variability, then that yield map really doesn't have a whole lot of value to you. So in some ways, you want to be able to first prioritize and look at maps or layers of information, which is kind of the same as a map, and say, where is it that it's exposed, that there's variability, reliably and exposed variability. It reminds me of a paper, I don't know when it was, maybe about 6-8 years ago, of a group of folks from where I did my undergraduate degree out of Brigham Young University, and they're data scientists. They work with data all the time, and they got some data from agricultural fields and so forth. And the whole analysis of that paper was, and Samantha, you may have heard me talk about this before, but the title of the paper is "How Good is Bad Weather?" And it was basically saying bad weather is really, really a good thing. Most people would take the year 2012 here in the Midwest, and they would say, just throw it out. I mean, it's so bad. And again, from the standpoint of money in the pocket, it was a bad year. You didn't even cover the cost of inputs. It was a bad year. But from the standpoint of exposing the soil and the abiotic stress that you're going to get from water deficiency on a drought year, it was a wonderful year. Okay. Yeah. And so a yield map from that year is maybe actually one of your best maps that you have available to you. The same would be said of maybe some remote sensing imagery or work that you might get with some drones, where you have a really, really wet year and you've got nitrogen deficiency that's different in different parts of the field. When you've fertilized it all the same, but we got this area of the field that's really yellowing up, and it's really showing that either the crop, it's probably not going to be because of crop demand so much, it is because we lost it. We lost a higher percentage of nitrogen we put on. So how good is bad weather from the standpoint of the extremes? Too wet or too dry are probably going to be years that give you yield maps that you really should be given more attention to in terms of developing management zones. And in the future, we hear the people in the climate science tell us that we're going to continue to have more extremes. It's going to be hot, and it's going to be dry, it's going to be wet. And depending on where you're at, perhaps in the Midwest, but understanding how these weather extremes are going to affect their crop means we need to pay attention to those years that we have had that already show that. And we look at those yield maps and we start to say, well, this area of this field is causing us some problems relative to nitrogen, or again, it kind of ties back to water. So I would say, don't ignore bad weather years. Bad weather years are great years to help give you the best understanding of soil variability within fields. And then build upon that. I'm not sure I'm still answering your question really well.
Sure.
But I kind of think of it from the standpoint of, again, a priority. What is it that causes differences within the field when it relates to water? And start there and make sure that you understand things from a soil water standpoint first, and then you build on to that other things that may be important. And how you go about it from the standpoint of building the zones, with you take those, you could take those yield matches, you could draw those in yourself, if you got a good visualization of that. And you don't need a software can do it too, but you could do it yourself on those really extreme years. You can really expose differences within the field. Anyway.
No, that's awesome. So there's a lot of companies out there that are advertising or say that they make management zones. What are the biggest mistakes that people or companies are doing when it comes to making management zones? And what should farmers kind of be wary of when a company says, here's what we recommend for your field? What questions should they be asking?
Two thoughts. The first one is reinforcing what I already said is make sure that you think about the why question. The why is, if there's a management zone is fundamentally, it's driven on the basis that there's variability in the crop and its response to your management. And so if you can't tie that management decision to the input information that you're building that on, and it doesn't, you have a hard time relating those two things, then I think there's a fair chance you're going to miss. So on that delineation of those management zones. So I would hope that producers would be very skeptical, and go in there and say, okay, well, you give me these management zones based upon this information. Tell me about the agronomic relationship between the information you've given me and the decision of what I'm going to do differently within the field, and make sure that they have the sales pitch, from whoever's doing this. They understand it well enough. They're not just a marketer. They understand the agronomy themselves. And they say, and so this is where agronomic science can't be discarded. It is kind of flashy and it's fun and it's electronics and it's big data and it's, it's a lot of exciting things when you start looking at these big data sets, but at the same time, it's also has the I think it has the potential to for an individual just to just say, oh, well, that technology is so beyond my understanding that I'm just going to trust. It's a similar type of, I would suggest it's similar to what you and I should be when we go in to see a doctor. If we go in and see a doctor and the doctor says, your knee is messed up, you've got some pain there, it's messed up, and we're going to go and we're going to operate on it and do this. And you better be asking some questions. You may even want a second opinion. You may even want to get, well, show me the x-ray or the MRI that supports this decision.
Yeah.
That's right. And show me that. And it's exactly the same mentality a farmer should have when it comes to management zones. Show me the details here and help me to understand that. Because I don't want to buy into this if I don't understand it. You're better off maybe not doing it. So that's the first. The second thought that I have there is probably the temptation to divide fields up too much into too many management zones. Start pretty simple. Maybe it's 2 or 3, and make sure you can kind of show that if you do it at a level of 2 or 3 different management zones within a field, that it really did was worth that effort, because management zones are going to cost. It comes in the cost of time or getting that sensor data, and it's paying someone to help you do that. But and in the end, they need to be able to do an analysis to show that because you did this, you had this kind of return on investment. So that would be the other thing that I would include that farmers do. Don't just buy into it because it's a great concept, but buy into it because they are also going to come back and show you how you got that return on investment. So and start small. 2 or 3 zones per field. Obviously, if you're next to a river bottom, an alluvial soil where there's a lot of the genesis of that soil is such that you got a lot of variability. It may be a few more zones than that you're going to go for, but start small.
Yeah.
I think that's great, because we've harped a lot in some of our previous episodes about like making sure your data quality, your layers are quality, making sure you're not just using one year of yield data. You brought up 2 things that we haven't discussed much, so that was awesome.
Yeah, and I kind of want to just dig in a little bit more on that optimal management zone concept. So if you're starting small and you've got, maybe you're trying management zones out for the first time, you've got 2, and then maybe you say, well, there may be a third one here and I want to move to a third one. At what point do you stop breaking down your field, and can you decide that you have reached that optimum number of management zones for what you can manage for on your field, and what's actually, being effective profitably for your field?
So, and let me back up and kind of also answer the question this way. And, obviously farmers typically have many fields that they manage. I don't know what the average number of fields in Nebraska is. Off the top of your head, what would you say it is? 15?
I would guess
20?
15 to 20.
Oh, wait,
Yeah.
I would say 15 to 20 would be my guess.
Okay, 15 to 20 different fields. Well, the other thing then would be able to say, okay, which of those 15 to 20 fields that you manage, do you already know that there's, you can even go look at the NRCS, soil maps, that you already know. This is where their observations have already fine-tuned. Show me which 4 have the most variability when it comes to production. So it's also then start with those fields that you already know that have that variability, and they have an intuition for what those fields are. Mm-hmm. And so you start with those, and then the second part of your question really was, where do you stop?
Yeah.
How many zones? That's a tough question. Again, and it's going to vary depending on the input that you're trying to manage. If you're managing water, and you have, through your own experience or working through a company or some extension people or whatever, you've come up with some kind of a relationship that has expressed soil based on texture, organic matter, so forth, the plant available water, and you've been able to map that soil as a continuum, okay, which is what a soil really is. It's not a bunch of boundaries out there. The only time the boundaries is when you walk to an edge of a cliff. There's a boundary there, but soil is a continuum, and it's like this. It's not now it's this, now it's this, now it's this. So the more the data we get in the future helps us to inform us to be able to quantify or qualify soil. Actually, it's quantify it as this continuum, and then management zones actually is not going to have a place, because we're actually going all the way up to where there is no management zone. We're just treating this field as this variation that's changing at all steps through the field. Mm-hmm. And then you've got something that represents the soil as it really is, and then you truly can hopefully build an algorithm that basically is just kind of making changes as you go through the field. So maybe that's down the road a little bit, but when it comes to water management and nitrogen management, we're probably not that far from that. It's not classed. It's not management zones. Management zones is a classification by its very nature, its boundaries. So the more we can get reliable information that gets us to treating a soil as a continuum, or the landscape as a continuum, the more we're going to be able to make those, we're going to punch that into the controller, and as we go to the field, it's going to kind of go up and down, and it's going to change as a continuum. Certainly that's what happens when you're using sensors to drive how much nitrogen you put on the field already, because the crop itself is the bioassay of the nitrogen status of the plant. And if you're changing, you're saying, oh, it's good here, but we're kind of growing to an area where it's gradually getting worse. It's just, you're basically letting those sensors, the plant sensors, as picked up by your hardware sensors on your tractor, detect that and make adjustments on the go. So there's some things that some inputs that may never get past a management zone concept, but there are some things that I hope that we're just looking at the management of that field as a continuum. And in that case, how many management zones? Each part that you're able to make a decision to make a change on becomes its management zone, and that can be pretty small.
As fast as your equipment can keep up.
That's right.
Right.
Application resolution is key. When you're talking about that, it's interesting. So I'm thinking about some of the differences in my research and Sam's research as she's using these active sensors and kind of has equipment that's able to apply on those small resolutions. Whereas, in my research using UAVs and trying to inform center pivot applications of fertigation, we've got a big swath that we're trying to manage over. And so maybe management zones mean a little bit more in that scenario where we can't control on such a high resolution.
Yeah.
So
at least at this point.
At this point.
Yeah.
So one thing I kind of want to dig into a little bit more, you've talked about what the next step is beyond management zones and working with fields as a continuum, as basically a surface that we're operating on. When you think about integrating sensors with management zones right now, and then moving towards that continuum process, what does that transition look like, and what technologies do you foresee coming in the near future for that?
Well, you're the engineer here. That's probably a question I should bounce right back at you. I think the idea of integrating the sensors with current operations like they're doing, like Smart Firmer does, is kind of a breakthrough, because it's kind of making us think about how we use sensors in a kind of more of an integrated way, as opposed to, I'm going to go out and sense this for the purpose of sensing it only. So, and so I think that's kind of a pioneering effort relative to doing it that way. I think that there's a lot of room for improvement, as I mentioned before, with those type of sensors, and maybe even fusing sensors and that sensor information in a more informative way. Sensors, Adam Chuck has done a lot of work relative to different types of sensors and helping us to understand this sensor looks at things this way and this way and this way. And you got electromagnetic, you got light, you've got all these different sensors that have been used in all kinds of different industries, are being brought into agricultural applications, but that still there's some basic biophysical things that these sensors can do, and how well we can take that information and make it to where it's packaged in a more reliable way for that that property of interest that we're going after, I think is where we're going. I mean, we've talked about this for years, but I think we're still struggling, because when you go out into the field, and you can do it in the lab, but you go out to the field, things are just always not, there's uncontrollables, there's things that happen, there's variation that you didn't anticipate. And so these sensors right now, their limitation is because we just don't have the library of information, particularly when we start fusing sensors together to help us to give that reliable information. So I think that's probably where we're going to in the future, is learning how to fuse this information together in a more complete way.
I love that response. I love how you talked about how much harder things are when we truly get into a field. I mean, these technologies are great, but they've got to be exposed to every scenario they could possibly be in order for us to really consider them efficacious, I guess.
And year after year, you talked a lot about temporal variability. They may work some years and then they don't work as well others. So final question. What is one piece of advice that you have to offer to our listeners and how to manage the information that digital ag is now, throwing at them, and when it comes to spatial variability, or one piece of advice in general?
Well, I maybe it's being redundant with something I already said, that we all need to put on a little bit of a, our Columbus, the explorer kind of hat, and say, go out there and discover, go out there and think of the business that you have as a farmer as an opportunity to discover more about this, to be skeptical. I mentioned that word before. Be skeptical with what is being marketed at you. I would say it's, I don't immerse myself in this area a lot, but it wouldn't surprise me if at least 50% of what comes at farmers in terms of marketing is really overhyped. I feel that way when it comes to some of the biologicals amendments that are being pushed. I think that there's maybe some value in a few of these things, but by far, I think it's just not proven in a lot of environments. Maybe under certain controlled situations, it showed to be helpful. But so be skeptical, and yet recognize that you have, with these technologies, the tools to be able to explore the questions that will matter to you and your operations. Combination of some simple some yield map information. Sit down, if you don't understand the agronomy, sit down with somebody who does, and it kind of starts helping you ask the questions that will help lead you to likely answers of why there are differences within fields. And so I guess that's my advice. To see the world as a great frontier still of being able to learn, and your farm is one I envy. I wish I had land myself. I don't. I told my wife I would love to go out and just 5-10 acres, just kind of do some fun things on 5 or 10 acres. That's how I grew up, with some land doing those kind of things. And career paths sometimes take you down a road that don't allow you to do those things, but it's one of those things I wish I hope to be able to still do in the future. So anyway, it's don't be intimidated. God's given you a mind to be able to think through these things. So be willing to recognize that that's maybe even the purpose of your experience here on life, is to learn through your farm.
Thank you, Newell, for joining us today on the FarmBits podcast. We've had a pleasure of working with Newell through our research and extension projects, so now it was great to sit down with him and dive into his expertise a little bit more. And for me, my favorite part with Dr. Kitchen was when he talked about how soil is a continuum. So eventually the goal would have all applications and management that match that continuum. So right now with management zones, they're a great intermittent step to manage site specifically, but eventually we'll be moving away from these distinct zone boundaries to the point where things can be applied more gradually.
Yeah, that's a really great point, that management zones are a good way to help us synthesize information now, but that they may not be the most effective way of characterizing soil spatial variability in the future. So for me, I really loved what Newell said about beginning with the end in mind when it comes to management zones. It's a great idea in a lot of things, but especially here with management zones. So the data that goes into management zones and the zones themselves really should be tailored to what exactly you're planning to do with those zones.
Absolutely. I also just wanted to add that I really liked his piece of advice at the end where it said, be sure that you are being skeptical. There's a lot of new and exciting companies and technologies, but we hope that, that we are sharing with you through this podcast that you are sure that you really understand the realities of new technologies and be sure that you are taking the time to ask the tough questions.
Yeah, no question. Asking the tough questions is really important, and really I think the more critical thinking we can do in all things, but especially when it comes to digital ag, the better it is for our industry. So we hope that you'll join us next week as we will be transferring these prescription maps into applied fertilizer recommendations and discussing application technology with Dr. John Fulton from The Ohio State University. Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback, so if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can also be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the views of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.